Before we get started, some brief words about the presenters. Eddie Moore Jr. is one of the nation's top motivational speakers and educators, especially for his work with students in grades K through 16. He's founder, program director for the White Privilege Conference, one of the top national and international conferences for participants who want to move beyond dialogue and into action around issues of diversity, power, privilege, and leadership. Allie Michael is the co-founder and director of the Race Institute for grades K through 12 educators. Her previous books include Raising Race Questions and Everyday White People Confront Racial and Social Injustice. And she sits on the editorial board of the journal Whiteness and Education. Allie teaches in the mid-career doctoral program at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, as well as the graduate counseling program at Arcadia University. And Marguerite W. Penick-Parks currently serves as chair of educational leadership and policy at the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh. Her work centers on issues of power, privilege, and oppression in relationship to issues of curriculum, with a special emphasis on the incorporation of quality literature. But enough from me. I'd like to now pass the floor to Eddie, Allie, and Marguerite for today's presentation.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. Jeff, I'm live. You can hear me good?
Yes, perfect.
All right. We are excited, ready to go. Listen, we want to start by showing you the picture of three people and what they look like after they publish a book. We are very happy at this moment, but what we'd like to point out as part of this picture is leading up to this moment, there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that we didn't agree all the time, and we still don't agree all the time, but we feel like it's important to let you know that because part of this book's success is from a diverse group of people agreeing, disagreeing, agreeing to disagree, but as we like to say, blood, sweat, and tears, really grinding it out with a commitment to collaboration and cooperation. Again, we believe in the individual teacher and the teacher's skill set. However, we do believe that if we're going to see any success, any moving the needle, any changes associated with this topic, it's going to happen because of a diverse group of people who are committed to collaboration and cooperation. Additionally, speaking of diversity, we really worked hard as part of this book project to gather as many diverse voices as we could. We have scholars, we have parents, we have teachers, we have kids even contributing to this book project. So the collection of work that you see here is really a diverse group of people, again, following the model of collaboration and cooperation. Each chapter, we were really concentrating as part of this book project to make each chapter bite-sized, manageable. I mean, this book has been designed for the school teacher. You could have an issue in first period, look over the book chapter in second period, and be ready by third period. Each chapter is concise. Each chapter is followed by an action item, and then also a personal story, a vignette that goes alongside of the overall chapter. So we've, again, tried to create this so that you could learn something, you could do something, and you can see and feel the implications of the work associated with a personal story. Last thing we want you to know is we organized the book in three parts: understanding, respecting, connecting. Today, we're here to share a little bit of each of those, but the idea is that the school teacher understands where they're coming from, respects the diversity on where the Black boys come from, and then puts it into practice. And so that's what we're going to be sharing with you here today. Thank y'all for joining us. And I'm going to pass it on to Allie, who's going to help us with the section around understanding.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to see you all checking in on the webinar chat, and so nice to have you all here. I know we're from different parts of the country, but the one thing we have in common is we're all experiencing extreme weather today in different forms. So it's nice to have you here with us to think about understanding. That's the piece I'm going to be talking about today. Understanding. Understanding is about understanding self and understanding how we've been socialized. So all of us have socialized to have a race, to have a gender. And I'm going to talk specifically today about how white women are socialized. Because when we first started writing this book, we had a parent ask us, do we really need a guide for teaching Black boys? Can't we just love them? And we thought about this question for a while. And I think what we came to as editors is that white women, everybody in our society, including Black boys, but especially white women, taught in so many ways not to love Black boys, not to trust them, not to understand them, to stereotype them, or to fear them. And so if we want to have a relationship based on love and understanding, then we have to do a little bit of work on ourselves first to undo some of the socialization that we've been given. We also, when we sent out requests to all of the authors to see if they would be willing to write chapters for us, we got back a lot of responses that said basically, if white women want to understand how to teach Black boys, first you have to understand yourself. And so that's why this first third of the book is dedicated to self-understanding. Eddie, would you go ahead and progress the slide? So I'm going to talk a little bit about my racial socialization. First, why this matters is that 85% of the teachers in the U.S. are white, and most of us grew up in racially segregated communities. Most white people today grew up in racially segregated communities because that's the story of the 20th century in the U.S. And so when you grow up in a racially segregated community, you often don't have experience with Black people, with Black linguistic styles, Black cultural styles. And so a lot of your information about Black people, Black communities comes from media. And that's part of the racial socialization story. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a picture of my house. I'm going to tell you a little story about myself and my own racial socialization. It's prefaced with this question: what messages did you grow up with about whiteness and about Blackness? And we invite everybody listening today to think about this question. When people first asked me this question, when I was first invited into conversations about this kind of thing, I remember people saying, well, what racial messages did you receive growing up? And I would think, I didn't have any racial messages in my house. And I thought that because my parents didn't use racial slurs, I didn't get racial messages. It was a struggle for me to see some of the implicit messages I got and some of the quiet messages. So in my house, we didn't talk about race. I grew up in a community. My house was in a suburb of Pittsburgh, in a middle-class white community it was 99.8% white. And we didn't talk about race. My parents thought that to raise a good child, a good white child, although they wouldn't have said that, you need to be colorblind. And we didn't talk about, if you don't talk about race, you're not able to talk about racism. And so a lot of the racial messages I got were through omission, through not talking about it, not seeing it, only getting messages about people of color through through media. We also, in my community, we were predominantly white. 10 miles away, there was a predominantly Black community, a couple. There was one called The Hill, which is where all of August Wilson's plays take place, another community called Wilkinsburg, and we never went there. So nobody said to me, those communities are off limits, but by virtue of not going there and having my social space so constricted, I grew up with the message: Black communities are unsafe, white communities are safe. Black people are unsafe, white people are safe. And again, nobody actually told me this, but there was enough news reporting that I took in and suburban legends that we had at my school, that I had a lot of stereotypes about Black people and Black communities, but no disconfirming evidence, no counter narrative saying you should question that stereotype. And so this is part of my early racial socialization. It impacted who I was friends with, where I went, who I felt comfortable with. It still implicitly controls what parts of the city I drive through when I'm not being conscious and aware. The question for me is, am I driving through the city with my implicit bias in the driver's seat, or with my conscious brain that is unlearning some of that implicit bias that I learned earlier? So we invite you into this conversation, which, the book will really support you in this questioning about what are the messages, and it gives you a number of different options and describes them so that you can say, well, what resonates with me? What feels like a message I got? So what ends up happening is you take implicit. I want to share a little bit about implicit bias, and I'm going to share some research in the next slide. This comes from Diane Finnerty, who wrote chapter 4 of our book. And Diane Finnerty is, she basically took a bunch of research on implicit bias and put it together in a way that's really succinct in terms of how it impacts Black boys and white women. If you're interested in the implicit bias that you have, you can take this test at Harvard's website. And just Google implicit bias Harvard, and it'll take you to a link. I take the implicit bias test every time I assign it to my students, and I'll say that I regularly get an implicit bias score in which I have bias against Black people in favor of white people. And I don't share that because I'm proud of it. I'm not proud of it. I share it because I think bias is not something that we can get rid of immediately. And the first time I got that score, it was like, wait a second, how can I even be an editor of this book? How can I even do this work if I am also guilty of having implicit bias? And the more I work on implicit bias, the more I recognize it's not about getting rid of bias completely. Obviously that's the goal, but in the meantime, it's about understanding that I walk through the world with bias, that this is part of me, and that when I grade papers, when I evaluate journal articles, when I hire people, that I have implicit bias that's going to impact how I hear people, how I see people, and how I interpret what they're saying. And there are ways that I can work against my implicit bias. So let me share a couple of research studies from Diane Finnerty's chapter that help us understand how implicit bias shows up in school. Go ahead, Eddie. Would you mind going to the next slide? So in this study, researchers sat preschool teachers in front of a TV and said, watch the video, count the misbehaviors in the video. And when there's a white boy, a white girl, a Black boy, and a Black girl in the video, preschool teachers kept their eye on the Black child 42% of the time. If they were looking evenly at all the students, it would have been 25%. What's interesting is that there were no misbehaviors in the video, but that's where people's eyes were drawn. Again, I imagine that might be true for me if I were to take this implicit bias test that they were doing, because that was part of my socialization. So understanding that that's part of what I bring into the classroom is going to be key in terms of improving the experience of Black boys in my classroom. In the next slide, you'll see that this translates into preschool suspension rates, that 42% of suspensions in preschool are Black children, even though they only represent 18% of national enrollment. The next slide demonstrates how we tend to adultify Black boys. And this is something that's borne out in the psychology research, which if we're seeing boys as 4.5 years older than their chronological age, how are we going to punish them differently? Are we going to expect things from them that are not developmentally appropriate? And then how does that impact their experience of school, particularly if multiple teachers are doing that? Good. In the next slide, you'll see that even the way that Black boys are named can impact how they're perceived, especially early on by teachers. And then the last slide shows that even how Black boys walk will lead often to them being seen as having lower academic achievement or being more highly aggressive. And so all of this really demonstrates kind of how not only the experience of Black boys in my classroom, but the child in my classroom is going to see lots of teachers throughout the day and get a lot of this implicit bias coming at them. So go ahead to the next slide, Eddie, and I'll show. I just want to say that there are many ways that implicit bias impacts what happens in the classroom. Obviously, as a teacher, I'm a gatekeeper for many different things. And so all of these aspects of my job are going to be impacted. And go ahead to the next slide. But the reality is also that in the countless tiny interactions, that's where implicit bias really shows up, that students have with teachers every day that really impact relationships. Students are going to, encounter teachers who don't differentiate well between Black students, or not as well as they do between white students, which is something I found as a part of my implicit bias. What that means is they're regularly going to be called the wrong name. They're going to be mistaken for somebody else. Often when there's a problem in the classroom, it's the Black student who's called out first. If there's noise in the classroom, it's a Black student who's called out first. And so in all of these ways, a student is showing up to school and feeling alienated in their relationship with the teacher and with the teachers that they come into contact with throughout the day. This is part of how implicit bias shapes the experience of the student and why it's so important that we work on our own bias. So let's leave this slide behind and go to the next one, because this is the bad news. Implicit bias is really the bad news. And I want to share a little good news. This is I want to talk about racial identity development. If you've heard of this before, this comes from Janet Helms, who's a Black psychologist, who says essentially that there are these predictable stages that white people go through as they learn about the existence of racism. And I don't know about you, if you've heard of this before, but for me, this changed my life because it made me aware that feeling guilty is not the be all and end all of developing my white racial identity. So in fact, I really encourage people to read this chapter and over again as they go through the book, because you'll probably go through many of these stages in the process of going through the book. But the first stage is contact, when you have first contact with the notion that racism exists. And before that, for me, I spent 18 years being kind of unaware of racism. And then my first awareness of it started to shatter my notions of fairness and my idea that everybody has an equal shot and that we should be colorblind. That's actually why they call the second stage disintegration, because your image of a just world starts to disintegrate when you learn about the realities of racism. That's when I learned that my home, Mount Lebanon, it's a predominantly white community. Predominantly white communities, or almost all white communities, don't happen by accident. That's not something that I realized previously. But that disintegration stage leads to feeling a lot of guilt. And I remember feeling so much guilt. And I remember thinking, this is what I can do for racial justice. I'm going to show up, I'm going to feel guilty, and I'm going to make other people feel guilty. but that's I think this is what is called for. If somebody in disintegration stage might never discipline black boys because they feel too guilty for the racism they have to experience, they don't want to discipline them. What I didn't realize at this point in my life was that I was just at stage 2 of a 6-stage process that I was going to go through over and over again, that my guilt wasn't helping anybody. Where we want to get to is, first, we want to get through the stages of identity development to understand this process. I feel like today I'm in all the stages at the same time to different degrees. But autonomy, the final stage, is really the beloved community stage. This is the stage where we take action, we work in solidarity in multiracial community to change systems and structures that hold people back. This might be a stage where you work in coalition with people of color to hire more teachers of color, knowing that that's what's good for your Black students. This is where we work towards building the beloved community, where each of us can show up and be our full selves, where we don't have to check any part of ourselves at the door, and where we can work with one another to work against one another's oppression. So I encourage you to check out this chapter just to see where might you be right now in your identity development, and without judgment, to hold it loosely, to say, okay, this is where I am. And then for me, I think it was just really liberating to realize that I don't need to stay in guilt. I don't need to stay in anger. Pseudo-independence is a stage where you might think you know all the answers and you want to do them all yourself, which is really an impulse that comes from white racial socialization. And at that point, you can say to yourself, actually, that's not what this is about. This is about working in coalition, working in solidarity with others. I just want to say one last thing, which is that we're not trying to say white women are the problem. In this book, we're very clear. The problem is a system that puts 85% white teachers in classrooms where students of color are more than 50%. This mismatch is a problem. White teachers are, in fact, positioned to be the solution here. And in fact, given our demographic reality, we can't make these changes without white women. So we need white women, we need white teachers to be on board. So I'll pass the mic back now to Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. Thanks, Eddie. And he'll be talking about part 2 of the book, which is respecting.
Dr. Ali Michael, thank you for that. Such a powerful piece, which I think really, again, announces in such a definitive way in the framework of how we designed the book, the research. I mean, nobody's colorblind. No one treats all their kids the same. I mean, we all have bias. It's not about if you have it, it's about where is it. And then the action, all right? Presenting the Helms model as a way to move forward, that you don't have to stay in this same place. And then lastly, to connect it to your own personal journey, a reflection of some sort, a personal story. And so that is so in the framework of how we've designed this book. Next, from understanding, we go to respecting, really trying to now ask the white woman teacher to understand the diversity, the complexity that the Black boy brings to the classroom, to the school building, day to day, every day. And part of this comes from our conversations with teachers, asking them, what do you know? What did you learn? So let us just play you just a little bit of that so you can just hear some of what we're hearing from teachers in reference to what they've learned, what they know when it comes to Black boys in their classroom.
Eddie, I don't hear the sound.
So again, this is a really rich interview that we have here, and there are many of those in the book in the QR codes. But what we're trying to get at here is really this piece around the white teacher and what they know, what they understand about themselves, but also respecting and understanding about the Black boy in this respecting piece. And so we just wanted to show you a little sample piece of that. Our activity here really now asks the learner, the teacher, the educator to think about Black boys from youth to adult. And so we show this slide, and I'll give you just a few seconds to do what we ask our audience to do. And that is, see if you can name all the Black men in this video, in this news clip, in this slide. So here you go. You got 30 seconds to think about it. Okay, okay. You'll have to penalize me if I cut you short on your 30 seconds. Just trying to stay within our time frame. Here, the idea here, though, most importantly, is to think about the diversity in which Black boys show up in your classroom, in your school building. And as Ali said, we operate from the framework of affirmative, that if you're asked, can you do it? Can you bring a Black boy to his highest point possible? That your response should be, yes, you can. And in order to do that, though, you have to understand the complexity, the diversity that the Black boy brings to the classroom, to the school building, day to day, every day. As you can see here, we have some distinguished Black men. And what we're wanting to know is, can you now bring a young boy from this picture to the highest point possible, this picture, when they're ready for college by the age of 16? We're hoping the answer is yes, you can. In order to do that, what we're saying in the respecting chapter is you have to understand the complexity and the diversity that the Black boys bring to the classroom. That's how you're going to bring about Black excellence. That's how you're going to bring about Black brilliance. And so what we've also done in this chapter is we've listened to Black boys. We've interviewed Black boys, we've interviewed Black men. We've tried to, from those interviews, bring forth some answers to any questions you may have. I mean, what has the white teacher done that has worked? Where has the white teacher fallen short? What do you wish your white teacher had known? So in this respecting chapter, in this interview as well, we're really trying to hear from the Black boys and really understand some of the things that they've seen work and some of the things that they've seen fall short, as well as Black men who have gone through this process, asking them what's worked, what didn't work, what they wish the white teacher can do for their Black boy even today. The other piece that we look at is this piece around code switching, where we are seeing Black boys succeed. We're seeing them do so by adjusting who they really are. And so that's where this code switching piece comes in. And we think this is an important piece for white women teachers to be understanding as well, is the adjustments that often Black boys have to make people feel safer, or to make it feel as if he is ready and committed to learning. Sometimes that means he has to make some adjustments to his cultural and upbringing. And again, not to saying what is right, what is wrong, just to think about the toll it takes in reference to having to switch and adjust who you really are. Last thing we like you to think about is motivation, inspiration. I mean, this is tough work. If we're going to shift the numbers around Black boys in school today, it's going to take some tough work, some blood, sweat, and tears, as we mentioned earlier. And so what we want to know is not what got you to the table, but what keeps you at the table. And so another part of what we're asking folks to explore here in this respecting piece is really your motivation. What you're looking at here from me is really what keeps me at the table as the father of a Black boy, as a Black man who was once a Black boy. I want to do all I can to help, assist, support, inspire Black boys to go from school to university as opposed to school to prison. And so this is a day-to-day motivator for me. And we ask that we all take that exploration, and we've all done that. And we ask you to consider doing that as part of the respecting piece as well. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marguerite Penick-Parks, who's going to take us to our third piece. And this is around the issue of connecting. And so, Marguerite, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Welcome from Wisconsin and our snowstorm. I would like to say that I come to this as a high school teacher who grew up in Iowa and ended up teaching in the urban schools in Kansas City, where I taught a predominantly African-American community and really didn't feel prepared to enter the classroom that I was really thrown into because my cooperating teacher kind of left and never came back. But one of the things that we think about when we talk about the connecting is really what I'm going to talk about is what we would just consider good teaching. The reason it's so important here is because when we look at the academic achievements and the things that are going on with our Black boys in schools, it becomes even more important for this group. However, I also want to be certain that you understand that we put this third in the book on purpose, because as teachers, we know what we all want to do is go in and say, please, please, just tell me what to do, just tell me what to do. But we don't want you to do that, because the first thing you need to do is do the work of understanding the whole identity that we bring as white women to the classroom. We then need to do the work that we need to do to understand the culture, the language, and learning styles, and all of that. So with my next slide, one of the things I'd like to talk about that comes from the chapter is, if Dr. Moore is going to switch my slide. Thank you, Eddie. One of the things from one of our authors, he says, if the teacher does not connect with the student, it's not the fault of the student. It's the adult's responsibility to find a way to make that connection. And this is really one of the things that I want to focus on, is this idea that if the student's not learning in the classroom, we have to figure out some way with which to greet or meet that student where they are. One of the things we know is that historically, our classrooms are set up to follow what Horace Mann started, which is an assimilationist idea where we can mass produce as many people in a quiet environment as we can. And then not all students learn that way. So one of the things that we really want to do is have to take a step back from the system that says you have to meet this, and say, no, I have to meet my student. And how do I do that? The next slide that I have gets to some of the work that Dr. Moore was talking about a minute ago about code switching. Adults must learn how to code switch to connect with the students. What we know is so often the students are asked to code switch into what we know are dominantly white middle-class learning styles. But at some point as educators, we need to switch to the students, and we need to write lesson plans and all of that with which, so that we can get to the students and how it is that they best learn. The next slide that I have, Dr. Moore, the next slide that I have is one of the things that I really like to talk about, which is this idea of Bloom's taxonomy. And I always tell my pre-service teachers to keep Bloom's taxonomy in front of you. 70 to 75% of what we teach in schools is at the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy: knowledge, comprehension, and application. That means that it's all about the what. But we also know that there are a lot of students coming to our schools who are really thinking at the why level, but not so good at the what level. So we've really got to have lesson plans that allow all students to be successful, as opposed to students that are successful only in certain learning styles. The left side is Banks' level of multicultural education. This comes from a matrix from Ford and Harris, and there's a couple of chapters in our book by them. But what we also know is at the lower level of multicultural education, if we teach contributions and additives, that's what we tend to do in schools. Oh, look, we made a piñata. We have talked about Mexico. Oh, look, we talked about Martin Luther King. Now we understand everything else that's going on. So the idea is that both contributions and additive are at the bottom level. What Banks says is that in order to reach all of our students, we need to look at things at the transformative level, which is where we look at things from multiple viewpoints. So the transformative one that he uses in his book is to talk about the American Revolution, because everybody learns the American Revolution, but we learn it from one point of view, the viewpoint of the rebels. I always say go to England and take history of that war. We'll just call it that war, and see if you get the exact same history, and you won't. But if we also look at the American Revolution from the viewpoint of the Loyalist, if we look at it from the viewpoint of the Native Americans, if we look at it from the viewpoint of, oh, that dinging is my phone, I'm sorry. If you look at it from the viewpoint of the women, if we look at it from the viewpoint of the African Americans, that what we need to do is look at that, and then we teach our students how to think by making connections. Now we're getting them at their critical thinking skills. And the more we can teach students how they're connected to each other by exploring multiple perspectives, the more we will get them engaged in their learning, and the more the learning will be relevant to everybody who's sitting in the classroom. The next slide talks about 3 real important pedagogical issues. One is literacy events and the ways of knowing. What this is talking about is that literacy in schools traditionally falls under white middle class values, which is reading and writing, and really reading and writing in what's known as standard English, standard white middle class English. But there are multiple ways for literature or literacy with which to happen. And you have music, you have art, you have dance. All of these are forms of communication, and literacy is simply forms of communication. So when we look at our lesson plans, we have to look at what are we valuing as ways of knowing, and how can we change our lessons so that we can value multiple ways of knowing. One of the essential components of project-based learning is the idea of voice and choice, so that we can allow students to choose what they want to, because one of the things we know is if our lessons are engaging and if they're relevant, then students will be much more engaged. I added this last part from one of the chapters in our book, which I really liked because it's a great example of what we can do very easily. We collect files on our students, we collect files on their tardies, we collect files on their what their test scores are, on their absentee, on their parents, all of this stuff. But do we ever really collect a file folder on what our students like? And then do we use this file folder to go back and look at our lessons? If a student is not being engaged in our classroom, can we not use that to say, oh, well, maybe if I add this book? There are multiple ways with which we can pull children in, or students in, to it if we will just simply look at where can we engage them and make our lesson relevant to them. One of the next screens talks about what can we do. One of the things that is very clear is the idea that we need to look at our library and our curriculum. We need to look at what's hanging around our walls. We need to look at what voices are valued in our classrooms and what voices aren't. Less than 2% of young adult and children's books have a protagonist who is a Black boy. That's less than 2%. So when we look at the ideas of who do they see, it's not just about it being a window or a mirror. My pre-service teachers in Wisconsin will often say to me, well, why do I need multicultural education? All of my students are white. And I want to say to them, maybe because all of your students are white, because it's got to go both ways. It's so important for that Black boy to see a prominent African-American in their classroom, but it's also just as important for that white student to see a prominent African-American leader in their classroom. So it's got to go both ways. But one of the things I'd also like to say is there's no reason to recreate the wheel. There are phenomenal resources out there. I've listed on the next slide some of my favorites that I go to when I really need to say, okay, I need help here. We have Teaching Tolerance. Teaching Tolerance will give you lesson plans. They just have lesson plans, and you say, I need a 3rd grade lesson plan for blah, 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 and they have it. Rethinking Schools has a bunch of wonderful books and things that are out there. I put Cooperative Children's Books Center on there. This is one of my favorites. They have 50 multicultural books every kid should read, 30 multicultural books every teen should read, books on social justice, bilingual. But the other thing that they do is they are live people, and if you can't find a book, you write to them, and they will answer you and say, well, have you seen this? And they will give you books if you can't find one. Of course, the American Library Association has the Coretta Scott King Award and the John Steptoe Award if you're looking specifically for some of the best books with Black boys and or Black protagonists. And I put in the bottom there another live blog, American Indians in Children's Literature, although it's not specifically about Black boys. Debbie Reese does a wonderful job of looking at books on power, privilege, historical accuracy, and all of that. And once again, she's another live person who should be able with which to answer your questions. So for my last slide, when I look at resources, because I do sit on the Coretta Scott King committee, my last slide, there are so many wonderful books out there. You just really need to know how to go out and look at them so that your classroom doesn't represent that 2%. Your classroom's got to represent, 50-some% of our kids are now diverse. Your classroom has to be diverse, and there's so much good out there. I could have put 50 slides up that look like this from a variety of fiction, nonfiction, inventors. And one of the things that is really important here when we start looking at what is in the curriculum and how do we bring it in is one thing we have to do is build our competence as white teachers to feel comfortable with material so that we can feel confident to bring it to our classrooms so that we can make our students be both competent and confident. And so with that, I will turn it over back to Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Dr. Penick-Parks. That was phenomenal. I'm going to just follow up with your resource slide with another resource slide, which again just points to what we hope is a real awareness around this topic that says there's no reason to be in the dark, so to speak, or without any knowledge around this subject matter. I mean, you're just looking at another small sample of some phenomenal resources following up from Marguerite's slide, in addition to a few other resources, including one of our previous books, as well as Allie's books. We also list one of our favorite conferences, and we hope that professional development around conferences and professional learning and other spaces and places, if resources allow, is a part of your ongoing development as well. Again, let me just quickly say before we move to our last homework slide that this book has been designed in a way that it's not a book that you read and you're done. It's actually, we hope, a book that you have by your side day to day, every day. And as anything comes up in the course of your teaching and working with young Black boys, this book can be a resource. That the three components of understanding, respecting, and connecting are always intertwined. That by understanding who you are, by respecting where the boys come from and the dynamics and the diversity associated with that, that it helps you with your craft, that you become a better practitioner, a better school teacher. So I just wanted to emphasize that point as well. Now, I want to turn you to your homework slide. Who would ever thought you'd get homework on a webinar where here it is. This is your homework slide. What we're asking you to ask amongst your friends and colleagues with this slide is who's more powerful, who's more dangerous, and what are the things going into answering this question. But also remembering, as we mentioned earlier, that this is not a book looking at it from a deficit model, that we believe that the white woman teacher possesses an incredible amount of power and influence, and that day to day, every day, over time, they are the ones, in the words of Nina Simone, gonna help young Black boys to be young, gifted, and Black. So please use this slide, examine this slide, review this slide after the webinar as part of an ongoing conversation. We really ask that you consider doing that as part of your homework. Now, Jeff, I think we want to turn to some questions. Yeah.
Sure, I have some questions. Here's the first one. You mentioned that teachers should code switch to connect with Black male students. Can you elaborate on what that looks like? What does it mean for a teacher to code switch in an authentic way, not culturally incorrect? What's a correct way, an authentic way for teachers to do that?
Well, for me, I would say the key there is authentic. I think the way that you can make adjustments or do some code switching is through an authentic effort to understand the culture, the background that a young Black boy comes from. And therefore, if a kid comes from a a background where music or poetry or cooking or holidays, whatever may be a part of how they are able to connect to the curriculum, that you are making an attempt to authentically understand that and bring that into the classroom. Allie, Marguerite, that's my quick response. Anything from you?
I guess for me, when I say authentically, once again, it's about how we go about creating the lessons. And so when I say code switch in a lesson, what I'm saying is make your lessons relevant and not always follow the same model. Teachers like to teach the way they learn, or they like to learn. And if 85% of our teachers are white teachers, then they're going to teach in that manner, but not everybody learns in that manner. So when I say code switching with lessons, I'm saying you need to write lessons that meet students where they like to learn best, not just where you like to learn best.
Terrific. I have another question. Let's see. Independent schools are intentionally selective, and many were established to attend to the education of white males. What recommendations would you make for those in these selective environments to support young Black men?
Allie, you want to start that one?
Sure, I can take that one. Yeah, I think, different independent schools do this differently, but particularly because so many of our Black students are sometimes one of only one or two Black students in their classes at independent schools. We have a number of resources in this book for thinking about supporting students who are first of all, really addressing that demographic reality and trying to shift it so that Black boys are not isolated socially. We also have a great chapter on stereotype threat written by the wife of Claude Steele, who designed the idea of stereotype threat, which we know is really heightened by being in a predominantly white environment. Claude Steele's wife, Dorothy Steele, and her co-writer wrote a chapter on creating identity-safe classrooms. So really taking the theory of stereotype threat and making it relevant to the classroom level K-12. We have a chapter on the N-word and dealing with the N-word in classrooms and in literature. And another chapter by Elizabeth DeNevy, who asks, what if being called a racist is the beginning of the conversation and not the end? So again, when you have, you might encounter in an independent school a teacher who really doesn't understand a child's reality, and when the child says, but I feel like this is racist, the teacher's thinking, no, there's no possible way. I'm not, because so many of us are taught that the definition of a racist is somebody who's intentionally hateful or violent. And Elizabeth says, no, a racist could just be somebody who's teaching from a place of implicit bias. And there's a lot of room there to step back, not get defensive, and respond to what's happening in this child's experience.
Only thing I will add to that is, I think related to what Allie was saying, and that is that start with the fact that these are institutions started by a small group for a small group, and that the success of Black males wasn't a part of the original design. And that I think understanding that as part of what you want to accomplish, I think assists in trying to accomplish the goal. And so I think by starting there and then providing resources, support, training, and partnerships and collaborations, I think allows for that success to happen. But it's got to start with the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I appreciate the questioner raising that up.
Terrific. I have another question. Can you share an example from your own teaching experience of code switching?
I guess I could do one. When I was teaching, I taught high school theater, and I really loved Shakespeare, and I really wanted to do Shakespeare, and my students really didn't want to do Shakespeare. So I was teaching, this will tell you how old I am, it was before rollerblading. But I wanted them to learn Shakespeare. So we did Midsummer Night's Dream. But I don't know if you'd call this code switching, but for me it was getting Shakespeare the way they would learn it. So we did it on roller skates. And if you know anything about Midsummer Night's Dream, it's slap happy humor. And we built ramps and had the kids. So really what I was doing was trying to take something they wanted to do and meet it with something I wanted to do. And I know I'm looking at these texts that are saying it's really culturally responsive pedagogy, and it is. That to me is what it is. It's finding something, instead of always making them meet me where I want to be, which was Shakespeare, how can I meet them where they are, which at that time, once again, I'm older, was roller skates. So that was one way of sitting down and taking a look at something I wanted to teach, but trying to figure out a way to teach it that it would be relevant, engaging, and in essence, make them willing with which to learn the Shakespeare that I wanted to teach.
Yeah, and I think the point around this being really a call for CRT, culturally responsive teaching, is a very good one. I think there has to be a fine line examined, though, because sometimes, for example, in math class, we see people change the name of the people in the math problem, and they consider that, culturally responsive teaching. And so what we're saying, what I would suggest is really having an understanding of something deeper than the name of the people associated with the math problem, maybe some of the applications of the math in people's neighborhoods around the conditions or the resources, but also maybe even some real connections to some of the concerns associated with whatever the math problems may be. So I think it just allows for a deeper and challenging exploration that sometimes doesn't get covered when people are allowed to just what it seems to be superficially incorporating the students' viewpoints by bringing in a few names from their neighborhood.
Terrific, thank you. Let's see, I think we have time for one more. Let's see here. How much does getting to know parents and or primary caretakers relate to being able to teach, learn, and relate to students better? How much does getting to know the parents really help in the teaching process?
I can start on this one. I think this is such an incredibly important aspect of what we do as teachers, but often there might be some a barrier to building relationships with parents. We have a number of chapters that were written by parents to talk about their experiences with teachers. And it wasn't that they didn't want to talk to teachers and tell teachers what they were dealing with, but what they found was a wall of defensiveness that was so great that it was really hard to communicate to teachers what they were experiencing. They would find that their children would experience little slights here and there, and that they wanted to partner with the teacher to talk about it. But they often found people who were so desperate not to appear racist, they were unable to actually meet their own goal of not being racist because they couldn't connect with the parent over the struggles that their kids were having. And so this is one of the big reasons why we invite teachers to really work on whatever socialization they had, especially if it was to not talk about race, or don't talk about race unless you can get it perfect, or try to, to really just lean into the conversation and build that relationship and find out what kids are struggling with, so that you can best serve them and their families.
The only thing I can add to that is I think the importance is consistency, courageously, and with care, meaning that, you may not succeed on the first try. I think that, as Ali mentioned, you got to be really ready to hear what may be some uneasy or some challenging responses and reactions from parents. And last thing is not to go into it as if you're saving these kids or something's wrong with these kids. That there is a partnership, a collaborative, a cooperative model about bringing the kid to the highest level possible, to Black brilliance, Black excellence, not a savior, but a partnership. And so that's the other piece I would add to that parent and primary care connection.
Terrific. That brings us to the end of the presentation. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'll end with a resounding thank you. I'll pass it to my teammates to see what they will end with. Marguerite?
I just want to say thank you, and I'm enjoying reading the chat. A lot of people are giving some really great examples, and I like the relationship model of all of you sharing with each other. So thank you very much.
Allie?
Yeah, I would say pick up a copy of this book and move boldly into the next stage of development, whatever it is for you. Thanks.
Well, thank you everyone for joining today, and that concludes our presentation.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
I want to see some of the chat. I couldn't see it. I want to see what they're saying. All right.